Good morning, you beautiful bastards. What is going on, YouTube universe? This is Zirra, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join me for another AFL tips, predictions, and discussion video, where today we reflect on the round that was round 3, and we look ahead to getting our tips in for round 4, and I can only hope I can fucking tip more than 4 correct in a round, because rounds 1, 2, and 3 for myself have been pretty consistently fucking shit. Round 1, I went 4 out of 9. Round 2, I went 4 out of 9. Round 3, I was hopeful I could get at least 6 or 7, but I got 4 out of 9. The round opened up with the Bulldogs taking on Brisbane at Marvel Stadium, and there was a lot to go down surrounding this particular game. You had the Bulldogs, who were playing incredibly lackluster football. You had Brisbane, who bounced back off of a thrashing in round 1 to defeat Melbourne quite convincingly in round 2. And then we come to this game where Brisbane were expected to do the same thing to the Bulldogs, and the Bulldogs just flipped the fucking switch and got the job done on the back of ArghGodzirra, who kicked 5 goals, was the match winner in my books by a country mile. And this was coming from a player who originally was going to take time away from the game because of the racial vilification he copped from St Kilda fans the week before at the St Kilda Bulldogs game. And I wouldn't have blamed him for wanting to take time away from the game, because racism is something that still rears its ugly fucking head, not just in this sport, but everywhere. Whether it's sport, whether it's just on the street with a random Joe Blow, social media is the biggest, toxic pool for racism. There's no room for it, and I can't get my head around the fact that after a history that has been built on different races being segregated and degraded, that we're still living within a society that has to deal with that shit. Ironically, it was 30 years to the day as well that Nicky Winmar famously lifted his St Kilda Guernsey, pointing at his skin to mark the racism that he had been copying as an Aboriginal player. ArghGodzirra comes out and he's done the exact same act, and I don't know whether he knew consciously if it was the anniversary of that moment, but his hopes, he even said at the end of the game, was in 30 years time, young Aboriginal boys and girls can look at that moment in time and say that, Jamara stood up for our culture. He stood up for us as individuals. It was a really empowering moment. It truly was. Friday night at the MCG saw what I thought was going to be a blockbuster game against Collingwood and Richmond, and it is a game where Collingwood should have beaten Richmond by 10 goals comfortably. Hitting the post as many times as they did, missing regulation set shots, really opened the door for Richmond to stay in this game. Richmond only kicking the 1 goal, I believe, before half-time, and then Noah Cumberland gets activated at half-time, which I actually said on social media during some live feeds that I was, chatting with other supporters in, that Noah Cumberland will probably be activated at halftime and watch him come out and make a difference. And he came out. Richmond kicked the first 3 goals of the third quarter on the back of Noah Cumberland injecting himself into the game and setting up every single one of those goals off his own boot. Structurally, I feel Richmond came into this game incorrectly. We know they were without Nathan Broad because of that suspension against Adelaide's Parnell. We had no Dustin Martin injured, no Jaden Short injured, no Jacob Hopper injured, and I feel those players would have made a big difference, considering we coughed up for the first time this season a lot of contested ball, a lot of clearance ball. Players like Jordan De Goey, I think he had 35 disposals. Nick Dacos, he had probably 30 odd. I think again it was another game back-to-back where the Dacos boys had 50 plus disposals between them. They were just running rampant, and they still looked the goods. The one thing I really can't get my head around, though, is everybody on the back of that game is talking about how Collingwood have set the standard. Now, I said coming into this game that Collingwood have been the standard setter for 2023, but to say Collingwood is still premiership favourites based off of that win, but then for people like Cam Mooney to come out and turn around and say that Richmond will only just make finals off of that performance and they're going to get belted by other teams off that performance. Are we going a little bit too early? Are we judging teams a little bit unfairly? I would say this if it wasn't Richmond, if it was anyone else, because I've said it a couple of times in these videos that I feel the media goes the early crow way too soon. Talking about Collingwood being a premiership favourite and a premiership contender, well and truly, that's well in the conversation. But bearing in mind Richmond came into this game with injuries, as Collingwood did, I would have rathered, and I said to a lot of you guys at home who I chat to on social media that were Collingwood supporters, that, you know, I would have rathered our clubs meet head-to-head at full strength. That way we could really test where each other's clubs are at. And I'm hoping Richmond and Collingwood get another chance to verse each other at full strength, because when they do, it is great to watch. That being said, as a Richmond man, very proud of the effort the boys put in, especially the young kids that came up to fill those empty slots through injury and suspension. And I'm still very hopeful for this year and every other year moving forward. We're 3 rounds in, still 20 odd rounds to go. Anything can happen, and it was Richmond's first loss for the year, so still being able to sit in 8th position after copping this bit of a touch-up, I'm incredibly happy. Down in Tasmania, we saw Hawthorn take on North Melbourne in a game where I was convinced North Melbourne would continue their winning streak. They'd go 3-0. And Hawthorn came out and surprised the world. Hawthorn made some changes around the ground, and they brought in players like Tyler Brockman, who had a really big game for them. But I feel, again, this might be a reflection on gaps that are left in a team when certain players aren't playing, because Jai Simpkin for North Melbourne missed this game on suspension. We had Luke Davies-Uniacke, who has been the best player in the competition in my eyes the opening 2 rounds. He was pulled out at the very last minute, and then you take those 2 players out, and North Melbourne's, midfield battle kind of was a shade of its former self compared to the first 2 rounds. And I feel these 2 players, even though, the old slang is, there's no I in team, there's definitely an I in Jai Simpkin, and there's definitely an I in Luke Davies-Uniacke, because these 2 players are something else, and they really lift North Melbourne to a new level. But it was still good to see players like Harry Sheasel still getting out there and winning a lot of contested ball, getting a lot of, hands on the footy. Some contentious things that come out of this game. The biggest one was Jai Newcombe executed a tackle where he not only pinned Griffin Logue's arm, but he also went further and chicken winged the arm. And if you don't know what a chicken wing is, it's basically when you've got the player's arm and you wrench it kind of backwards like that, and you kind of, you pull on it in a certain way. That was the action that it kind of looked like. He deliberately tripped Griffin Logue. You can see in the footage of that tackle in isolation that he puts his leg in front of Griffin Logue to trip him forward, and then drives the head straight into the ground. Now, Nathan Broad had the book thrown at him last week, and the AFL gave him 4 weeks for a dangerous tackle that could have caused further injury and did concuss a player. This week, we have a player execute a tackle where he prevents any ability for the player being tackled to prevent the fall because the arm is pinned. He deliberately trips a player, forcing momentum to come down harder on the ground, and the player goes head first into the ground. This, in my opinion, was a worse tackle than what Ryan Burton laid on Jamie Elliott, and Jamie Elliott's tackle resulted in Ryan Burton copping a 2-week suspension. Jai Newcombe got a $1,000 fine for misconduct, and I still feel the MRO have some sort of fucking roulette wheel that they spin and it just lands on an outcome and they roll with it. They really need somebody new fronting this system, and they need to overhaul it because it's starting to become a fucking joke. GWS took on Carlton in Canberra, and it's a game yet again that brings up another discussion point, because in an arm wrestle contest where both teams were fighting for the lead throughout many parts of the game, Carlton were rewarded a free kick in front of goal, which essentially turned into a 7-point play. A behind was scored, the umpire called all clear, and then paid a free kick directly after for umpire dissent. Now, for those of you who are unaware, dissent was brought into the system, apologise for my English, brought into the system for preventing players abusing umpires and using foul language and being very derogatory and abusive in stance and pointing and everything else. It's a very borderline rule that a lot of umpires have gotten wrong. And boy, did they fuck this one up on the weekend, because all Stephen Coniglio did was put his arms out like this and say, how was that not a free kick? In a free kick where Harry Mackay had the ball, was tackled, it dropped out, could have been paid holding the ball, it then could have been paid holding the man, but the umpire instead decided to call play on. I think that's fair. I think that is a good outcome. But all Stephen Coniglio did was put his arms out and say, how was that not a free kick? No abusive language, no abusive demeanour. Umpire pays a free kick, Carlton kick a goal at a very momentous time in the game, and they end up winning by 10 points. It was definitely a goal that shifted momentum and changed the course of the way the game was going, and I feel it's something that needs to change. Now, this is a discussion point that I want to combine with the Jai Newcombe incident not being suspended and only getting the fine. When it comes to rules, when it comes to the MRO, when it comes to suspensions and everything else, how do you feel the state of the game is at? Where do you think it's at? What needs to improve? What has to, be taken away? What needs to be added? Whatever the case may be, let's have a chat about it in the comments down below. Moving on though, St Kilda took on Essendon in a game where one team was going to cop their first loss for the 2023 season. I tipped St Kilda, and I got back-to-back wins. Carlton came through and St Kilda came through. But Essendon showed a lot of heart in this game, because this was a game where St Kilda got out to 34-0 at one point, and then at one point later in the game got back to a draw, or close enough to it, late in the game. Essendon were putting on a press that St Kilda could not stop. But then, out of nowhere, St Kilda flipped a switch, and they piled on, 4, 5, 6 goals that Essendon weren't able to stop. And it's now, again, based on this defensive structure that Ross Lyon has brought back to St Kilda that we have failed to see for many years, that we probably haven't seen at St Kilda since Ross Lyon first coached them. And just being able to launch off of that half-back line, whether it be by hand or by foot or by just pure leg speed, and just being able to hit up targets. And we need to remember, St Kilda is still doing this without Max King, without Tim Membry. These players that have been so reliant on having to kick scores for St Kilda to win games, they're only going to get better with these guys coming back in. And this is a team, mind you, who in my season predictions, I tipped to be a bottom 4 team this season. However, yet again, just as I said about the media, we shouldn't go the early crow, because I think it was last year where St Kilda went 4-1 for the start of the season, and then dropped off quite severely later on in the year. So anything can happen. Anything could really happen, and we've seen this year so far in 3 games, anything can definitely happen. The first of 2 showdowns went down at Adelaide Oval, with Port Adelaide taking on Adelaide, and I thought Port Adelaide would get the chocolates here, comparing how they've been playing to how Adelaide have been playing, and I'm a fucking idiot, because Adelaide came out and not only won, but they put the foot on the throat of Port Adelaide and won convincingly. Isaac Rankin kicks 4 or 5 goals. You had Riley Thilthorpe, he kicked 5 goals. Just these players were standing up in big moments, and Port Adelaide yet again starting to show some things around the ground that are a little bit unsavoury. Jason Horne-Francis's defensive work is some of the most terrible defensive work I've ever seen. Now, you're talking to a severely overweight man who has never played AFL football before, and some of you are probably going to sit there and say, oh, you probably couldn't defend, you've never played AFL. They're all valid points, and from an armchair point of view, we can say as much as we want as, in regards to analysing how a player's playing without knowing how taxing it is to physically play at AFL level. But for a kid that was so highly touted, that went number 1, had all of this drama around him to want to go back home to Adelaide and, held North Melbourne for ransom in many different ways, comes out and plays a really big game round 1. Round 2 drops off the mark and showed some very poor defensive work against Collingwood. Does it again against Adelaide. To the point where when Adelaide were moving the ball, and even Collingwood the week before were moving the ball, Jason Horne-Francis, who is touted as one of the best young midfielders in the competition, is walking behind the play instead of jogging and trying to compete and just letting players go past him. And it is very lackluster. He's got to get this shit out of his game quick, otherwise Port Adelaide are going to struggle with him. Gold Coast took on Geelong in what was the upset of the season so far. And I know we're only 3 rounds in, so it's not much to really mark stuff off of, but this is a team that has had egg on their face and has been the butt of AFL jokes for many years, coming up against the premiers of the 2022 season. And the Gold Coast won. And they didn't just win, they made Geelong in parts look absolutely insipid. Gold Coast ended up winning by 19 points. I only know so far of one person who tipped the Gold Coast, and if you took a gamble on the Gold Coast beating Geelong here, for whatever reason, you're a fucking genius. But Geelong have started this year a shade of themselves, and there's a lot of people saying that, you know, they partied too hard on the off-season and they've had a restricted pre-season like any other premiership team would have, you know. But this is the first time in 47 years that the premiership winner from the previous year has started the year following 0-3. It is the first time since 2004 that Geelong have started a season 0-3. And currently, Geelong are the only team after 3 rounds in the competition to have not won a game. Gold Coast have won a game. West Coast have won a game. Hawthorn have won a game. All these teams that were expected to finish on the bottom of the ladder have all managed to pull out a win before Geelong. Yes, I know, it's still early, Zirra, we're only 3 rounds in, but I just want to point out the fact, this year is not going according to what anybody expected it to be, and with how teams have been performing, I really feel this year is going to be a real shake-up, and we're going to see outcomes that we didn't expect to see moving into this year. Melbourne took on Sydney at the MCG in a game where I thought Sydney's run and carry was going to get them over the line, especially historically over the last couple of years. Sydney have had Melbourne's number. Melbourne changed that fact in a very big way, and I thought they would struggle a little bit without Max Gawn, but then I remembered Sydney really don't have a ruckman that they can hang their hat on compared to a club like Melbourne, you know, that have a Max Gawn, or a Gold Coast that has a Jared Witts, or a Western Bulldogs that has a Tim English. Peter Ladhams is serviceable at best. And the fact that Melbourne ran away with a 50-point win here speaks volumes. And while everybody's still talking about Collingwood, I feel Melbourne is still very much in the conversation for the premiership this year. And the final game of the round was the Western Derby, where I tipped Fremantle, and Fremantle got it done in the end by 41 points. However, West Coast in dire straits here. This is a team that is coming off of a year that was hampered by COVID running through that club and preventing them from getting a fully fit team out onto the ground. There was 6 to 7 injuries to come out of this game that are going to see players missing time, and they were dropping like flies. By the end of the game, they had nobody to do any rotations with. Adam Simpson made a comment in the post-game conference that he turned around to speak to the players on his bench to try and motivate them, and there was no one to talk to because everyone was on the bench that was injured. They weren't playing anymore. So you got to feel for this club. This club's going through the ringer. If you're a West Coast supporter, the last couple of years, man, what a fucking roller coaster. As I said, another 4 out of 9 for me this week. 25th out of 31 potential players. Shocking start. If you haven't joined this competition yet, there is a link in the description of this video. Click it, it'll take you to the website. Sign up, it is free to play. Get on board, let's have some fun. If you're a Supercoach player, feel free to join my league as well. That's also linked down there. But before we can move on, a couple of congratulations are in order for round 3. Rockstar Pool 69, my brother from England, managed to tip the most correct amount of tips this week with 6 out of 9. So, sir, congratulations to you for tipping the most correct amount of tips. Fucking bastard. He's rubbed it in my face all weekend, I can assure you of that. But also, congratulations to Rockstar Pool 69 and James Effin Marshall for currently leading the pack on 17 total tips, equal first on the ranking standings. So, boys, congratulations. Now, before we dive into the tips for round 4, just a quick little reflection on how the AFL ladder looks heading into round 4. We currently have St Kilda on top of the ladder with Collingwood first and second, both teams undefeated after 3 rounds, with Carlton and Melbourne rounding out the top 4. The top 8 is then rounded out with Sydney Swans, Essendon, North Melbourne and Richmond. Fremantle, GWS, Adelaide, West Coast, Port Adelaide and Brisbane Lions round out the next set, with the bottom 4 currently standing as the Gold Coast, Western Bulldogs, Hawthorn and the winless Geelong. Now, I said this last week and I've got some egg on my face, but I'm hoping this week is a little bit more straightforward, because when we look at the games that are being played here, I think we can more definitively choose a winner, minus upsets going down. Thursday night at the Gabba, we have Brisbane taking on Collingwood. I am going to back Collingwood to go to Brisbane and get the job done by... let's go 16 points. Let's go a close game. It's going to be very interesting because Darcy Cameron is out for at least 6 weeks with a knee injury, which means Collingwood are going to have to play someone like a Dan McStay as a ruckman. And although Brisbane don't have an elite ruckman, Oscar McInerney is very serviceable in the way of being able to get his job done. He might not get a lot of disposal around the ground, but at least his tap work gets the ball to the Brisbane midfielders first. This could be a deciding factor in the game, but I just feel... I don't know, because we've had Brisbane get belted round 1 away from home, come back home and win, go away, get belted again, now they're home again. So do Brisbane beat Collingwood here, or are Collingwood too good for Brisbane? I don't know. Let's take a chance. I'm going with Brisbane. I've talked myself out of it. I might change the tip here, but Brisbane being back at home could be a factor here, considering Collingwood have played the first 3 games all at the MCG. So it's the first time they're leaving the safety blanket of their home ground. I'm going to roll the dice. Let's go with Brisbane. Good Friday football this year. North Melbourne Carlton sees 3rd taking on 7th, where normally, in the past, this is a bottom-ranked team playing a mid-tier team. It's actually a really good game coming into it, because I think both teams can give this a red-hot crack. I am going to back Carlton to get over the line here, but I feel it's going to be a much closer game than what people are going to anticipate it's going to be. Saturday kicks off at Adelaide Oval with Adelaide taking on Fremantle. I think Adelaide at home get the chocolates here. I said it in my predictions video at the start of the season. I feel Adelaide are going to be the big improvers this year. And if you keep into the equation the fact that they kicked very inaccurately against Richmond, they could have very well beaten Richmond round 2 and then beaten Port in round 3. So this is the chance for Adelaide to get just reward and go back-to-back wins and really set up a strong start to their 2023 campaign. MCG, Saturday night, Richmond taking on the Bulldogs. I am going to back my boys in here. Dustin Martin, Jacob Hopper, both confirmed to be coming back in. Unsure about Jaden Short. We know Broad still has another 3 weeks to serve with suspension. I think Richmond, now knowing that they went into that Collingwood game a little bit, destructured compared to what they should have been, are going to get the mix right now. Players like Noah Cumberland coming through, players like Hugo Ralph-Smith, Jack Ross, Ryan Mansell, those type of players that are now really standing tall as young kids and really having a say on how Richmond play is going to be pivotal to us not only setting up this season but many seasons to come. I'm worried that the Bulldogs midfield is going to do too much damage to us, but in numerous seasons in the past, we've seen Richmond get the better of the Bulldogs in that area, regardless of the fact that the Bulldogs dominating the clearance game, the contested game. So I feel this is going to be a very good game to watch. I'm backing my boys in at the G though, because let's remember, the last few times it's been at Marvel, Richmond don't like travelling to Marvel. So at home, I think my boys get it done. At Marvel, we have St Kilda taking on the Gold Coast. I'm going to take St Kilda here. I think this is a game, though, that could be a real arm wrestle, especially with Gold Coast proving that they can take it to a team like Geelong. I think St Kilda's setup, though, is going to be too hard for Gold Coast to crack. Saturday rounds out with the Swans taking on Port Adelaide at the SCG. Swans get back a win here. I don't see Port Adelaide travelling to Sydney and getting the job done. Sydney aren't going to let anyone rock up to their home ground and do damage to them. They'll be very disappointed with how badly Melbourne got on top of them. And after that loss, I thought to myself, fuck, I feel sorry for whoever plays Sydney next week, because Sydney's going to come out with a chip on their shoulder and they're going to go hard. And unfortunately, Port Adelaide fans, it's you. Sunday has 2 games, the first of which is Essendon taking on GWS at Marvel. I'm going with Essendon here to bounce back. Essendon have had a really solid start in the way of fixturing this year. And a lot of people, you know, have questioned whether teams like St Kilda, Essendon, North Melbourne, are they going to be able to find consistency through their season once they play some of the more contending teams? I feel this is going to be a test for Essendon, because GWS, when fit, can be a force to be reckoned with, and they've proven that this year. But I feel Essendon are going to be too good, especially with that press they put on St Kilda that was unstoppable for a certain period of time. If they can get that going for a more sustained period of time, this could actually turn out to be a bit of a blowout. Optus Stadium, West Coast hosting Melbourne. You've got to go Melbourne here, especially with all the injuries West Coast just copped. I probably would have backed Melbourne even if West Coast were full strength, because I feel Melbourne has the better team in general when you compare the two. West Coast are going to be in all sorts, and if you're a team that's going to be playing against them in the next couple of weeks, I think you'd be licking your lips at the opportunity of taking another, you know, defeated West Coast team. A team that's going to struggle to get some elite players out on the field due to injury, which is fucking sad, but unfortunately it's the reality we're living in. And the round rounds out on Easter Monday, with Geelong taking on Hawthorn. I feel Geelong get their first win of the season here. I don't see Hawthorn proving an upset, but if Hawthorn can trump Geelong and they start the season 0-4, holy shit, are there going to be discussions to be had. So reflecting on my tips, I'm going with Brisbane in an upset at home against Collingwood, Carlton, Adelaide, Richmond, St Kilda, Sydney, Essendon, Melbourne, and Geelong. Thank you guys once again for joining me for another video. Hope you guys enjoyed my insight. Don't forget to let me know in the comment section down below our discussion point of the day. What do you feel, and how do you feel, about the state of umpiring, the MRO, the rules that are currently standing? Do you think anything needs to change? What needs to be improved? Let's talk about it. Do leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, because it does help the YouTube algorithm realize that people are enjoying what I do. And be sure to hit that subscribe button as well if you're keen for more of this content. I can reveal on the down low, there is something big happening in the works, AFL related, moving forward, in the way of taking it from this channel and doing something completely brand new. So if you are keen on AFL based content, be sure to stick around for the time being. But moving forward, we're going to have a little bit of fun together. I'm really looking forward to this project I'm currently working on. But that's it from me, guys. I'm out of here. Good luck to your teams this weekend. And as always, I will catch you guys next time.